Hey everybody, this week we're going to be studying excerpts of Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published a little while after Douglas's slave narrative was published. So before we talk about Jacobs specifically, let's review some material from the last video on Douglas. So remember that slave narratives tended to have these four purposes in common. First, to arouse the sympathy of their readers, and remember that readers were typically Northern white middle-class people who were generally sympathetic to the abolitionist movement. Generally, that was their audience. And also to motivate those people to act. Slave narratives authors wanted to expose the cruelty of slavery to counteract some of the propaganda that was coming out of the South. They wanted to show also that they had Christian ideals in common with their audience, and to show the acceptance of mainstream American ideals. I'm sorry, my little video is blocking this last phrase here. This says American ideals, liberty, independence, justice, the kinds of things that were lacking, of course, if you were enslaved in America. Let's also review the basic plot pattern that these slave narratives tended to have. In the first stage, which is the bulk of a lot of slave narratives really, is the loss of innocence and the awareness of one's status as an enslaved person. As our book says, this focuses on slavery's physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual deprivation. So again, showing all kinds of ways in which enslaved people were deprived. And then that's followed by the resolution to be free, to escape. Eventually that escape happens. Often that's encumbered by many efforts to overcome evil and obtain freedom. And finally, the final stage is redemption, in which freedom is obtained. Remember that when Douglas achieves his freedom, he doesn't want to tell us how he became free. He wants to keep that a secret to protect others who might want to use the same channels to get out of slavery, and also to protect the people who helped him. And once he does obtain freedom, he renames himself. He takes the name Frederick Douglass, and he commits to activism. He commits to the abolitionist movement. So that demonstration of citizenship as well is an important part of Douglass. So I want you to think about all of these stages in Douglas's narrative and think about how they might be different for a woman. Okay, I want you to think about, in addition to, for example, to all of the physical brutality, the physical assaults, there's also a greater risk of sexual assault. I want you to think about childbearing and what that means. Remember that it was completely legal for people who owned other people to rape them and produce even more enslaved people. So women who were enslaved had no legal protections against these kinds of things. And then, of course, when they had children, that also adds another level of complexity to a plan to escape, because you might not want to leave your children behind. So I don't want to be spoilery in this video. I hope that you're watching this before you've read all the excerpts. But I want you to think about how Jacob's gender might shape her experience of slavery. I also want you to think about the canon and the history of Jacob's book. So you remember the literary canon, right? If not, take a look at previous videos for a review. The history of Jacob's book is absolutely fascinating. So it's published in 1861, but you might remember that in this country, things got busy in 1861, and with the Civil War, her narrative sort of got lost in the shuffle, and in the next century, it went into obscurity. Nobody really read Harriet Jacobs for about 100 years. It was just gone. This happens. We just lose texts, and they get rediscovered sometimes. And this happened in Jacob's case in the 1960s. There was a renewed interest in her story, in the stories of enslaved people during the Civil Rights Movement. And so during this renewed interest, her narrative was rediscovered and republished. But not everybody believed that it was actually a true story. Remember, slave narratives are true stories, right? Harriet Jacobs uses the pseudonym Linda Brent, and she has pseudonyms for all of the players in her book, Dr. Flint, and so on. But there were historians who said, no, this can't be real. This is a novel. Remember, a novel is fiction. They thought it was a work of fiction. They didn't believe that she'd actually written it. So even though it was rediscovered, it wasn't taken all that seriously for a while until the authentication by a scholar named Jean Fagan Yellin. The spelling of that is Yellin. In the 1980s, this young scholar, Jean Fagan Yellin, goes to North Dakota and finds all the documentation to prove that Harriet Jacobs was a real person. It's pretty astonishing. And she edited an edition of Incidents that was published in 1986 and really sort of changed the face of scholarship of Harriet Jacobs. And so now the book is canonical. Now, if you're taking a class like this, if you're an English major, you will hopefully read Harriet Jacobs. 50 years ago, you would not have. She had been lost. This is another reason why canon studies are so interesting. Sometimes things that are actually really wonderful works of literature get lost and rediscovered and reevaluated. So I want to talk about a couple things in the rest of this video. I want to talk about some social and historical context, and then I want to talk about some literary context for Jacob's slave narrative, thinking about some of the gender things that we wrote about before. If you've studied American history, you may have heard this phrase, the cult of true womanhood. These are ideas, characteristics that middle-class white women were expected to embody in the mid-1800s. In other words, women of a certain class, white women of a certain class were expected to behave in these certain ways, embody these characteristics. They were sort of groomed for it. They read books about it. This is what was expected of all women. First of all, they were to be pious. They were to be religious and faithful. Second, they were to be submissive. They were to obey first their fathers and then their husbands in all things. The man was definitely the head of the household, and the woman, there was a kind of a paternalistic relationship between husband and wife. So the wife submitted to all things. She was not to ever argue with her husband. I'm not saying that's how it was. I'm saying this is what was expected. She was to be domestic. This is the ideology of the separate spheres. It's another phrase you hear a lot when you study these things. Separate spheres ideology maintained that men were in the public world of business and commerce and politics and economics, and women were in the private sphere of the household. Women kept the house in working order so that when her husband came home, she and her household could have a good influence on him. Now remember, for women of upper middle class or wealthy women, they did this through the help of many servants, right? They weren't doing this all by themselves. But the idea is for women of most social classes was that they were to be domestic. Even if lower class women, working class women had to work, they were still expected to come home and take care of the house. This might still be familiar in a lot of households. And then finally, purity, sexual purity. A woman was to remain sexually pure until marriage. A woman was not supposed to have any kind of sexual desire at all. Men were allowed that luxury, but not women. And again, sex was only to take place after marriage. Is this how it always worked? No, of course not. But these ideas, by the way, according to historian Barbara Welter, were the dominant ideas that dictated how women were supposed to behave. Now, did these apply to an enslaved woman in the 1800s? Well, I want you to pay attention to how Jacobs deals with these kinds of expectations about proper feminine or female behavior. Remember, as an enslaved woman, the expectations might have been different. A white audience, and she definitely identifies her audience as white women, would not necessarily have expected her to value the same things. So pay attention to when she shows that she does, and pay attention to when she shows that she knows when she might be breaking expectations. I don't want to have any spoilers here, so we'll talk about this in our discussions, okay? I also want to talk about the literary context and the hero's journey, the monomyth. Joseph Campbell discovered that many myths in our culture, many stories, have these common plot patterns. And so I'm going to give you a simplified version of this here, and you may have studied this before in a high school or other kind of college class. If you look at these stories, we've got Mark Hamill peeking up over this video. We've got the Odyssey. Mark Hamill, of course, is Luke Skywalker from Star Wars. We've got the Odyssey, and we've got young Harry Potter here. What do these stories all have in common? Well, in the hero's journey, we see a basic plot pattern. Now, there's a lot more steps in this plot pattern, but I'm just going to crystallize them down to like 4 of them. We're going to return to this, by the way, again this semester, later when we read Toni Morrison, and probably before then too. So we have an orphaned boy, or a young man. He is somehow torn from his family in some way, and then he's called to adventure and thrust into a new world, a new place with new people, new experiences that he has to make sense of. And then he faces these battles. These battles are physical battles, to be sure, battles against monsters or wizards, evil wizards, battles, but they're also battles they're tests of character. So not only must he show his physical strength and courage, but he also must show his moral fiber. And then homecoming and reward. Typically, if the hero does it right, he is rewarded at the end, in the case of the Odyssey, with a homecoming. This journey has taken him far from home. He gets to come home, and then he is rewarded in some way. Now, I want you to think about how that applies to women. Because, again, women weren't supposed to go anywhere. They were supposed to stay home, right? So how do you write the great American novel with this kind of hero's journey if you're not supposed to go anywhere? So this brings us to domestic or sentimental fiction, sometimes just called women's fiction. This is a really popular genre of fiction, extremely popular. When Nathaniel Hawthorne was struggling to publish, he referred to these authors as the damned mob of scribbling women. These women wrote bestseller after bestseller. These books sold like hotcakes. Because of economic circumstances, there was a large reading audience among middle-class white women. So these novels were extremely popular. And what we find is that a number of them follow a similar plot. Sometimes this is called the plot of seduction, and sometimes it's called the marriage plot. Real quickly. By the way, this is all the scholarship of Nina Boehm, who was at the U of I for many years. First of all, a domestic setting. Remember, women weren't supposed to go anywhere. So this might have occurred in somebody's household, in a boarding school, places like that. The girl is orphaned, so she's taken in by somebody else. And in her case, her battles are often simply moral ones, and they often take the form of a really hot, rich man who wants to seduce her. Now, she's really flattered by this attention, and he is really giving her the hard sell. He really thinks, she really is tempted by him. This is the plot of seduction. If she gives in to the plot, if she gives in to the seducer, the hot, rich man who promises her everything, she's punished because she's not supposed to be sexual, right? So she's punished. Often these characters died alone after maybe a terrible pregnancy. Perhaps they were sick, they were outcast, they were definitely punished, often by death for their sexual transgressions. However, if they passed that battle and they resisted the temptation of the hot guy, she often ended up married to a good hot man. Okay, so marriage is the reward, and the reward also is a home of her own. I want you to pay attention to how all of these things apply in Harriet Jacobs' narrative. This final quotation from Nina Boehm says, "By the novel's end, she has developed a strong conviction of her own worth. That is, if she's not seduced." The heroine is rewarded with that idea of her worth. Consider this as you read Jacobs. Use the reading guide and watch discussions from my post, but think about how Jacobs works brilliantly within these expectations of her audience.